Walter Grady had been living on the streets of Brooklyn for over 10 years. At 66, he was more of a fixture than a person. The locals had come to recognize him, a thin, weathered man with a silver beard that looked like it hadn't seen a proper trim in years. He carried around an old military-style backpack, green canvas, its straps frayed and worn out. It had been years since that bag had been regulation issue, but to Walter, it was more than just a bag. It was a piece of his past, something that reminded him of a time when he had purpose, when he was somebody. But that time felt like a lifetime ago. Walter wasn't like the other homeless people around the neighborhood. He didn't ask for money, didn't cause trouble. He kept to himself, recycling bottles for spare change, sometimes accepting scraps from sympathetic restaurant workers. He slept in different doorways, never staying in one place too long, always avoiding becoming a nuisance to any one business owner. He didn't want to be a burden to anyone, but he was. He knew that. But it was easier this way, easier to be invisible, to be forgotten. Most people didn't know Walter had served in the U.S. Army for over 20 years. He'd been honorably discharged in 2004. But after his wife, Margaret, died from cancer in 2008, something broke inside him. It wasn't just losing her. It was the way the VA had misdiagnosed her illness, the way they had failed her. Walter had been through enough battles in his life both overseas and here at home, but this was different. This was a fight he couldn't win. So he rejected the help his family offered. He sold their modest apartment, gave the money to Margaret's favorite charity, and walked away from everything. He disappeared into the streets, a shadow of the man he used to be. He never wanted pity. He just wanted to disappear. Sometimes, he told himself it was easier to be nobody than somebody who had failed the person they loved the most. One cold November afternoon, when the temperature had dropped below freezing and the snow was starting to fall, Walter found himself in Morelli's corner market. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. His hands shook as he slid a loaf of day-old bread into his coat pocket while the store owner, Mr. Morelli, helped another customer. Walter had no intention of causing trouble. He just needed something, anything, to get him through the night. But Mr. Morelli had installed new security mirrors, and that's when everything changed. "Hey, stop right there," Mr. Morelli shouted, his voice sharp, already reaching for the phone to call the cops. Walter didn't run. He didn't make a scene. He just stood there, the loaf of bread still visible in his jacket. "I just needed strength to live one more day," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Within minutes, 2 patrol officers arrived. The younger one, Officer Jenkins, seemed uncomfortable as he placed handcuffs on Walter's thin wrists. "You really a vet?" Jenkins asked, noticing the dog tag chain around Walter's neck. "This ID's pretty worn out." Walter nodded. "I used to be someone useful." "Not anymore." He hadn't been asked for his military ID in years, and he couldn't help but wonder if it would even matter now. At the precinct, Walter was processed just like any other petty thief. A public defender briefly met with him, more focused on clearing cases than understanding the man in front of him. The court date was set for the following morning, a preliminary hearing where he'd formally be charged. The next day, Walter found himself in Brooklyn's municipal courtroom. He was still wearing the same clothes from the night before, wrinkled and stained. No family showed up to support him. No character witnesses came to speak on his behalf. Just a handful of reporters, a few lawyers, and court employees going about their usual routines. It was just another case. Another nameless, faceless person to pass through the system. The clerk called out his case. Case No. 47,293, State versus Walter Grady. The young prosecutor stood, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, the defendant was caught stealing a loaf of bread from the local market. Given his prior incidents of petty theft and lack of fixed address, we recommend continued detention until trial." Judge Michael Carmichael, known for his no-nonsense approach, barely looked up from his case file as he processed the information. "Mr. Grady, how do you plead?" he asked, his voice cold. "Guilty, Your Honor," Walter said softly. His eyes were fixed on the floor, as if he was speaking to himself more than to the judge. The courtroom chuckled. Someone in the back row snickered, and the judge shot a glare in their direction. But then, Judge Carmichael paused. He read the details of Walter's service record, and something changed in his expression. His hand tightened around the edge of the bench as he absorbed what he was reading. The room fell silent. Judge Carmichael's face drained of color as he glanced back at Walter. He stood up abruptly, making the whole courtroom freeze. "Court will take a 15-minute recess," he announced, his voice uncharacteristically rough. "The defendant will remain." The courtroom erupted in whispers as the judge left for his chambers. Walter stood there, unmoving. He didn't understand what was happening, but he didn't really care. For the first time in years, someone had noticed him. Someone had seen him. In his chambers, Judge Carmichael pulled out a photo from his desk drawer. A picture of a group of military personnel in desert fatigues, standing in front of a medical tent in Iraq. And there, standing tall in the back row, was Walter Grady. The judge's hands trembled slightly as he ran a search through the military database. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Walter Grady had been a staff sergeant, serving 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He'd been awarded the Bronze Star for valor when he drove a burning supply truck away from an ambush, saving 17 lives. There was even a photograph of Walter carrying an injured Afghan child to a medical helicopter, a moment that had briefly made him a symbol of American compassion. But what truly caught the judge's attention was a mission report from 2003. Walter had saved the judge's life. During a chaotic evacuation under enemy fire, Walter had carried a wounded medic Michael Carmichael 2 miles to safety, despite sustaining shrapnel wounds himself. The judge whispered to himself, "My God, it's him." For 15 years, the judge had tried to find the man who saved his life. He'd never even known his full name, just Grady, shouted across the battlefield. And now, here he was, standing in the courtroom, arrested for stealing a loaf of bread. Walter had disappeared from public life after his discharge. After Margaret's death, he spiraled into depression, his PTSD untreated, his faith in the system destroyed. He couldn't bear the bureaucracy that had failed his wife. The world had forgotten about him, and he had let it. But now, the very man who had once been saved by Walter was about to change everything. Judge Carmichael made a series of urgent phone calls, first to the VA office to verify Walter's service record, then to Colonel James Mason, a man who had served alongside Walter. "Mason, it's Carmichael. I found him. The man who saved my life at Fallujah. He's in my courtroom right now, homeless, charged with stealing bread." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I'm 3 hours away," Mason said. "Don't let him leave." Judge Carmichael wrote a note on official letterhead. "Walter Grady is not an ordinary homeless man. He is a symbol of loyalty forgotten by the country he served." The next morning, Walter was escorted back into the courtroom. This time, the room was full. News cameras waited outside, eager to capture what would unfold. When Walter took his seat at the defense table, he noticed that his public defender had been replaced by a distinguished attorney named Richard Harlow from the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance. "Someone's taken an interest in your case, Mr. Grady," Harlow said, but Walter was too stunned to respond. The courtroom doors opened, and in walked 3 military officers in full dress uniform. Colonel Mason was among them. Mason took the stand and spoke with precision, recounting how Walter had saved the lives of 17 soldiers during the ambush near Fallujah. He spoke about how Walter had carried the young medic, Michael Carmichael, to safety despite his own wounds. The courtroom was silent, every person hanging on every word. Then, the prosecutor, visibly uncomfortable, interrupted. "Your Honor, while this testimony speaks to the defendant's past character, it doesn't change the fact that he committed theft." But Mason wasn't done. He revealed that due to an administrative error in 2008, Walter's pension and benefits had been terminated. He had been entitled to over $246,000 in back benefits that had never been paid. The courtroom was stunned, and that's when the judge spoke for the first time. "Mr. Grady, would you please approach the bench?" Walter stood slowly, his hands trembling. "I didn't recognize you yesterday," Judge Carmichael said softly, his voice breaking. "But after reviewing your file, I realized you were the man who saved my life in Iraq." Walter looked at the judge, his eyes full of disbelief. He had saved this man's life, but now the judge was saving him. The state moved to dismiss all charges against Walter with prejudice. And with that, Walter was free. As he walked out of the courtroom, surrounded by cameras and reporters, Walter couldn't help but think back to the man he used to be. The man who had served, the man who had loved, the man who had tried to make a difference. And now, After all these years, it seemed that someone had finally noticed. The country he had once fought for had finally started to fight for him. What about you? Have you ever witnessed someone being misjudged simply by appearances? What does justice really mean? What does it take for someone to finally be seen?